Good. So the next tip that you need to be very careful about and you need to actually apply when you're practicing is to predict your answers. This might sound a little bit strange, but it's a very easy tip to follow. How do you follow this? Remember, the previous tip that I gave you said that you must follow the instruction that says you should read the questions before you listen to the tape. As the tape is played, you will get a part where they will tell you, you now have some time to read questions or to look at questions 1 to questions 10, or you have some time to look at questions 35 to questions 40. It is very important that you take advantage of this tip and look at those questions. The reason why those questions have been set that way and the reason why that tip is given to you is because the people who designed the test know that it's a listening test and you do not need to understand every single detail in the test. So the questions will guide you to the part where you need to put extra focus to get the information needed to answer the questions. The next tip that I will give to you will be something that will reinforce what I've just told you about predicting the answers. You can predict your answers by looking at the questions. So when you look at the questions, for example, if you're asked to look at questions 1 to 5, and when you check questions 1 to 5, what you find there are a question that asks you to put in a name, a question that asks you to put in a number, a question that asks you to put in a price, a question that also asks you to confirm what someone said. Ideally, when the tape starts, your mind will be more attuned to pick out the number that will be called. Your mind will be more attuned to pick out or identify the name that will be mentioned. This tip is very important and it's a very easy way for you to achieve maximum success in the listening part of the IELTS. Disregard it at your own risk. Because this pace at which the tape is played is quite fast. The answers also come at a really fast rate. This throws up a lot of challenges to non-native users of the language. How can you guard against this part where you may miss out on listening to 1 or 2 answers that will come in rapid succession? What you need to do is to always keep your eye on the next question. And I'll really explain what this means. You have a series of questions. Number 4, number 5, number 6, and number 7. It's a likely chance that the answers to number 4, 5, 6 will be mentioned in 2 sentences. So that's a rapid stretch of conversation. I might say something and speaker B responds to me. And in what I say, that sentence that I've uttered and the sentence that speaker B says, the answers to questions number 4, number 5, and number 6 are embedded in just those 2 sentences. What does this mean? It means that as a test taker, if my focus is only on number 4 and I'm waiting to hear the answer for number 4, immediately I get the answer for number 4 while I'm still writing number 4. The answers to number 5 and number 6 have been mentioned. And what happens to me? Because I didn't have any focus, because I have not included number 5 and number 6 in my focus, I will miss out on putting out those answers. Because immediately I finish writing the answer for number 4, the next thing my mind will pick. Remember, I can hear number 5 and number 6, but because my mind is not on it, my mind isn't focused on it, the next thing my mind will pick will be the answer to number 7. And that will mean automatically that number 5 and number 6 will remain unanswered. So the only way to guard against this is to take your questions 2 or 3 at a time. So when I am on number 4, I'm already focusing on number 4, 5, 6. Immediately the information comes out, it is easy for me to wait and not put down anything for number 4 and listen to the end of that stretch of conversation between speaker A and speaker B, so that I'll be able to get the details that I need for number 4, number 5, and number 6. This is a tip that you can only visualize, that you can only see in action when you apply it or when you practice. Which takes me back to the initial advice that I gave at the beginning of this video. The listening part of the IELTS is the most practical section. The only way to achieve success in listening is if you apply these tips and practice them more than once. If you do not practice, you will not be able to effectively apply this tip about keeping your eye on the next question or keeping your eye on a series of questions as they follow one another. Another tip that will be useful for you will be to make notes. Now, this is a tip that a lot of test takers see online. A lot of test takers hear from their tutors or from their teachers when preparing for the IELTS, and it creates a lot of confusion. Active note taking isn't what you're doing for the listening test. Active note taking entails you taking down every important detail or sometimes even irrelevant details from what you can hear. This will be counterproductive if you do that for the listening test. If you don't look at the questions and you're only listening to the tape and taking down what you feel is important or taking down everything that you can hear, chances are that you will put down a lot of information that will not be relevant to answering the questions, and that would result into a waste of time and effort. Allow the questions to guide you into or to guide you to the part where you need to make notes. Let the questions be your guide. Let the questions direct you to the part of the tapes or to the part of what you're listening to that you need to put extra focus on. So, if you've taken the tip about predicting your answers, reading the questions before you hear the tape, you already have a clear idea of what information you need to focus on. So when you start listening, it's easier for you to now make notes. For example, if a question asks me for a place and is asking for a specific location or a specific place, and I already know that I'm listening out for the name of a location or the name of a place. When I hear that name and the name ends up being Lanre's Black Bookshop, and the question asks me to write no more than 3 words, which means that Lanre's Black Bookshop will be the answer for that. When I am making my notes, remember, I am making my notes on my question paper and not directly on the answer sheet that will be given to me. When I am making my notes, because I know that the next information needed for the next question might come immediately after, I'm not going to write Lanre's Black Bookshop in full. This tip about making notes is more about generating or devising your own shorthand model to get down your answers. So the answer to Lanre's Black Bookshop will probably be written as LANBLKBKSP. LAN will be an abbreviation or my own representation of the word Lanre. BLK will represent black and BKSP will represent bookshop. Remember, I am the test taker using the question paper and the answer sheet. So it will be easy for me to just transfer what I have written in that shorthand format into the answer sheet in the exact or normal format or the longhand format that the examiner would need to assign a correct mark to that question. Remember, when you're using abbreviations, when you're using shorthand to make notes, ensure that the things that you're writing are things that you can interpret. You do not want to get into a situation where you write an abbreviation and when it's 10 minutes, the time to transfer your answers onto your worksheet, onto your answer sheet, you end up being confused as to what you've written down. You've actually forgotten what you've written down and you do not know what that abbreviation means. This is a hole that you do not want to put yourself into. Avoid that. Make notes using abbreviation, codes, shorthand that you understand and you find easy to interpret or translate into the longhand format. The next tip that you need to focus on will be voice changes. Remember, what you're listening to is 2 people or 2 or more people speaking. When they are speaking, their voice modulation will change from time to time. The pitch might go higher or the pitch might go lower. Every time there's a modulation in the voice, it has a specific thing that it means. It has a specific meaning that it conveys. Especially your section 3 and section 4, you will be given questions that might ask you to make judgments about what a speaker intends or about the meaning a speaker wants to convey when they use a particular modulation in a voice. I'll give you a classic scenario that this might come up. So, you have speaker A and speaker B talking, and speaker A says, "Hello Susie, I'd like to come to your town," which is New York. "What could we do for fun in New York?" And Brian says, "Oh, if you come to my town, we will go to the Walmart, we'll go to ShopRite." Let's say ShopRite happens to be a mall. We'll go to ShopRite in New York. Now, assuming that New York is a small city, it's a very small place where ideally they wouldn't have a mall or a mall that size, which is ShopRite, and speaker B already knows this, that New York is a small place and a mall the size of ShopRite will definitely not be in a place like that, or will find it very unbelievable. So speaker A says, "Oh yes, we will go to the ShopRite mall when you come, and we can have a lot of fun there." And speaker B says, "ShopRite? And that's all he says. ShopRite, New York, and that's all the person says. And the question asks you, what does speaker B mean when he says ShopRite, New York? Or what feeling or what impression or what meaning does speaker B convey in that utterance? Automatically, what they need you to do is to interpret just those two words, ShopRite, New York, and find out the meaning that it conveys. To a native speaker of the language, or to a very competent non-native speaker of the language, when the speaker B utters ShopRite, New York, it automatically conveys a feeling of disbelief. It automatically conveys that speaker B finds that information incredulous. It finds that information unbelievable. And this is something that the IELTS wants you to figure out just from the pitch of that voice. It's a tall order, but it is something that you can do if you practice. The more you practice, the more familiar you are with the different modulations of voice, the different pitches, and what they could mean and what they could convey in a stretch of conversation. Another tip that you want to be very careful about is finding the hidden meaning. Like I mentioned earlier, these questions, the type of questions that require you to find the hidden meaning or to use voice changes to find the meaning of what someone is saying, are usually in section 3 and section 4. Remember, the IELTS gets progressively harder. Section 1 is easier than section 2, while section 2 is easier than section 3, and section 4 is the hardest of all. As much as the order of difficulty increases, the questions all carry 1 mark. This fact is significant because you do not have the luxury of wasting time on a question simply because it is harder than the preceding question. The question that you spend 7 minutes on and the question that you spend 7 seconds on will both give you just a single mark. So resist the temptation to consider harder questions as questions that would award you a higher score. It doesn't. Yes, finding the hidden meaning in a conversation or in a sentence is a very easy thing to do. I'll give you a classic scenario where the hidden meaning is something that conveys a meaning different from what is uttered. Speaker A says, "Laura, have you completed? Are you ready for the project, or will you be ready for the project?" And Laura says, "Well, Brian, it took me 5 hours to complete 50% of the project, and we have just 1 hour before the project is to be submitted. It took me 5 hours to complete 50% of this project, and The project submission is due in 1 hour. And the question asks you, do you think that Laura will be able to meet up with the project submission? Ideally, this is a no. Laura will not be able to submit the project. Why is that? Laura spent 5 hours to complete 50% of that project, and there's just 1 hour left before submission. Do you think Laura, who spent 5 hours to complete 50%, will be able to complete the remaining 50% in under 1 hour? No. This is what it means when you say find the hidden meaning. These type of questions actually test higher level thinking skills. It tests higher level information processing skills. The lucky news is that these questions only come up in the third or the fourth section of the test. The next tip that we need to identify and work on will be to prepare for the gaps between answers. Now, this is a very funny tip, and this is one that personally I have experience in. When I was writing the test, when I was preparing to write my test, I had a very big challenge with the gaps or the pauses in between the listening tapes. So, for example, you're going to listen to track 1. Track 1 extends for 12 minutes, and track 1 covers all the first section of the test. The first section of the test starts from question 1 and ends at question 14 or ends at question 13. Question 14 ends at question 14 and is divided into 2 parts. Question 1 to 7 is one part, is a note where you have to complete, and question 7 to question 8 to 14 are just multiple choice questions that probably have to do with true, false, not given, or any other type of the format that the questions for the IELTS listening takes. When the tape for questions 1 to 7 has been played, there will be a short pause of up to 10 seconds or 8 seconds before the part of the conversation that you need to answer questions 8 to 14 is played. This gap in between answers is a very precarious time for a lot of test takers. Remember, you need full concentration for the listening test. And at the point where you're concentrating, the tape stops. And you have 8 seconds of silence before they play the next tape. Within that point in time, it's easy for your mind to wander. It's easy for you to think of other things. And once you lose that perfect concentration that you had for questions 1 to 7, it'll be difficult for you to get your mind back. Most times what happens is that if your mind wanders for just 2 seconds, by the time you want to get your mind back, it takes another 1 second to get your mind back. That 3-second space that your mind has wandered and wants to get back, you would have gotten questions 8, 9, and 10. You would have gotten the answers to them mentioned, and you've lost it. You cannot get it back because, like I mentioned earlier, the recording is only played once. This is a very significant tip that you need to put into action. You need to practice, you need to apply and practice as much as possible so that you do not fall victim to the gap in between answers. Another thing that we need to focus on, which is a tip that you need to apply, will be to avoid conversation answer traps. I mentioned earlier that the IELTS listening is broadly divided into 2 parts, conversations and monologues. For conversation, there's something that traps a lot of test takers, and this is called the conversation answer trap. What this means is that most times in a conversation between 2 people, the answer that you need is usually the last thing uttered in that stretch of conversation. In natural conversation, if you ask me, Lanre, when will you be coming to the office? I could say 7 a.m. And you say, are you sure? And I go, oh, I'm sorry. I just remembered that I have an appointment for 6:30 a.m., which means that it will not end before 7 a.m. and I will have to change my resumption time to the office to 9 a.m. For the non-native speaker of the language who is in a hurry to answer the questions, When Lanre says 7 a.m., the person goes ahead and quickly puts down 7 a.m. as their answer and shuts down his mind to that question, believing that I'm only listening for the information needed to answer the next question. However, Lanre went ahead to change his mind in that conversation, and he mentioned 9 a.m. as being the time that he would resume to the office. But because you as a test taker, your mind is already closed off to that question, you miss out on that. It's a trap that a lot of test takers fall into. What you need to do is to ensure that in a conversation, when people are exchanging information, you listen to the last thing uttered, the last information in that stretch, in that exchange of information, before you decide to put down your answer. It's a very difficult thing to do if you're not patient and if you're not wary of that, if you're not knowledgeable of that trap. It's a trap that occurs a lot in section 2. It's a trap that occurs a lot in section 3 also. In section 3 and section 1, which are the two parts where you have conversations. You need to be very sure that you have the correct information agreed on by both speakers before you put down your answers. If they ask you a question, so what do the students conclude? And the students are having a conversation about what part of their project, about what part of the assignment to start work on. And the first person says, let's work on the introduction. The other person says, the professor told us that the introduction is the least important part of this project, so we need to work more on our research findings. And they go back and forth about it. They go back and forth about this particular question before arriving at the conclusion that the introduction is the actual place where they need to start from. Because you, as a test taker, are in a hurry to put down the answer for that question, you would have probably written something else that was said earlier in that stretch of conversation. Patience, focus, concentration, and knowledge of this trap is the only thing that you need to surmount this obstacle. The next tip that you need to be very careful about is the role of synonyms and paraphrasing. When we started this IELTS multi-step program, and I listed the things that will be our guide throughout the IELTS multi-step program, synonyms and paraphrasing occupied the second position. Throughout the IELTS test, you're going to be depending heavily on your knowledge of synonyms and paraphrasing to answer questions in reading, listening, to answer questions or to use in your utterances in your speaking test, and they would also serve as one of the most significant areas where you can get maximum scores or you can increase your scores for lexical resource in the writing section of the test. As you can see, synonyms play a very important role in your success for the IELTS. So, the role of synonyms and paraphrasing in your listening test goes thus. Most times, the word that you have underlined, remember, you read the questions before you listen to the tape. When you're reading the question, a way for you to prepare yourself adequately for what you're going to listen to will be to probably underline the keywords in the question. So, for example, if the question asks you, where did the speaker go to? Or where did the clown go to? The keyword in that question will be what? Clown and where. Because you know that when you're listening to the tape, what you're listening out for will be the keyword clown and the location or the place that the clown went to. Now, you may not hear the word place. You may not hear the word location when you're listening to the tape. But because you already identified that word as a keyword, your mind starts throwing up synonyms, paraphrases for that particular word. And that is what will help you identify the word as it is coming out in that stretch of conversation or in that monologue that will be played for you. Synonyms and paraphrasing are very important because 9 times out of 10, the words in the question are not the words that you will hear when you're listening to the tape. So your mind needs to be very adequate and fast at providing synonyms, at providing paraphrases, at providing your own word definitions or description of the keywords that you have identified in the question. It's a very tall order to do all these things in the 10 to 12 seconds that you're given to look at the questions. But it is something that you can do with adequate practice and constant application of the tips that are shared in this video. A very challenging area for non-native speakers of the language is the identification of numbers or plurals. Number in grammar refers to if a word or if a noun is either plural or singular. Non-native speakers have a very hard time identifying plurals in a long stretch of conversation or speech. In the IELTS, if spelling is really important, like I mentioned earlier, if spelling is important to your answer and your answer is snacks and you write the word snack, you automatically have gotten that question wrong just because you missed the S at the end. What does this mean? It means that you must put extra focus on words, on utterances that have to do with more than one particular item, which is plural. Plurals have a way of disappearing in a flow of conversation. The S, the IES, the ES at the end of words have a way of disappearing when native speakers are speaking in a long stretch of utterances. You need to train yourself to be able to identify plurals when you're listening to native speakers. The only way to do this, like I mentioned earlier, is to practice, practice, and more practice. Looking at the questions before, going through the questions before listening to the tapes can also help you too in predicting if the answer that you're listening out for is a plural or a singular. Finally, guessing is recommended in the listening test. I'll take that again. Guessing is recommended in the listening test. And why is this? There's no guarantee that you will have all the answers to the 40 questions as the tape is being played. There are some questions that you might skip because you didn't hear what was said. There are some questions that you will skip because you were unsure of what you heard. And after you're transferring when you're transferring your answers into the answer sheet, those places cannot be left blank. Remember, each question carries 1 mark. For you to get 40 over 40 in the test, it means that you need to answer every question. No question should be left unanswered. And you've forgotten what you heard or you have missed out on what was said. What do? You guess. And how do you make an educated guess when you cannot listen to the tape again? By looking at the question, by looking at the answers that you have written down, you will be able to predict the flow of information and put in something that may be close to your answer, or luckily for you, there may be the likely answer. Guessing is recommended in the listening section of the IELTS. Finally, and the most important tip that you need to know for the listening test is you need full concentration. Concentration requires you to listen, read, and write at the same time. That's a whole lot of multitasking, which means that your concentration must be razor sharp. You must not allow your mind to wander. Even if you do not need to understand every piece of information in the listening tapes, you cannot afford to allow your mind wander because you do not know when the information you need will drop. Use these tips, apply them, and practice as much as possible. And I can assure you that you are on your way to a certain Band 9 or Band 8.5 in the listening section of the IELTS.